long before David ever picked up that stone. Something massive walked the earth. Bones too heavy for normal soil. Footprints pressed into rock like signatures from a forgotten war. The Valley of Elah remembers, not just one giant, but a bloodline. 5 brothers, each one bred for a single purpose, to make Israel kneel. You know the name Goliath. Everybody does. But Goliath was just the loudest mouth in a family of monsters. Behind him stood Lami, his blood brother, carrying a spear shaft thick as a weaver's beam. Zaph, the one who refused to fall. Ishbi-Benob, who came within inches of burying his blade into King David's throat. And then, the Nameless One, 24 fingers and toes, a walking mockery of creation itself. The Nephilim were supposed to be gone, erased, drowned in a flood that swallowed the ancient world. So how were they still standing in Gath, armored and breathing generations later? That question changes everything. The first time heaven wept over what walked below. It wasn't because of a serpent. It wasn't because of a fruit. It was because of the children. Genesis 6 opens like a wound. The sons of God, beings not born from dust, not shaped in a mother's womb, looked down at the daughters of men and wanted them. No courtship, no covenant. They descended and they took. The Hebrew word is unmistakable. They chose whichever ones they desired, and from that union came something the earth had never been designed to carry. The Nephilim. Picture it like this. A child born with the hunger of the heavens and the flesh of the ground, too strong for its own cradle, too angry for its own bloodline. These weren't just tall people. Ancient rabbinic texts describe them as devourers. They consumed everything around them. Crops first, then cattle. And when the cattle ran out, the texts grow silent, as if the scribes couldn't bring themselves to write what came next. But Moses did. He called them the mighty ones of old, the men of renown. And that phrase, men of renown, sounds almost heroic until you realize what renown meant in a pre-flood world. It meant everyone knew your name, because everyone was afraid of you. Fame built on bones, reputation carved with violence. Most conventional readings stop here. They assume Genesis 6 is just a strange prologue, a weird paragraph before Noah builds the boat. But look closer. The text says something terrifying in verse 12. All flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth. All flesh. The contamination had spread so deep that the genetic and spiritual blueprint of humanity itself was bending under the weight of what had been introduced. And God looked at it and grieved. That word, grieved, should stop you cold. The architect of stars, the voice that split light from darkness, looked at his creation and felt pain. A deep, parental pain. The kind of pain a father feels when he sees his children becoming something they were never supposed to be. So he made a decision that still echoes through every canyon and every coastline on this planet. Water. An absolute undoing. The fountains of the great deep cracked open from below, while the windows of heaven collapsed from above. 40 days of unrelenting erasure. The Nephilim drowned, their cities gone, their towers swallowed. Every trace of that corrupted experiment sank beneath miles of churning black water. Or so the story should have ended, because if you flip past Genesis, past the flood, past the rainbow and the covenant and the repopulation of the earth, they show up again. Numbers 13. The 12 spies walk into Canaan and come back trembling, white-faced, stammering one phrase that rewrites everything you thought the flood accomplished. We saw the Nephilim there. 4 words. And suddenly the flood isn't a conclusion. It's a failed attempt. A divine reset that somehow didn't hold. The giants survived or returned. or were reborn through a door nobody thought to lock? How? That answer lies buried in the bloodline itself. And what happened in the generations between the water and the promised land? Rain has a sound when it means to kill, deeper than any storm you've heard. A low, grinding roar, like the planet itself was being dragged underwater by something beneath the crust. The fountains of the great deep didn't just open. They exploded. Pressurized columns of ancient water, locked beneath the earth since creation, shot upward through fractures in the continental plates, while the sky above simply collapsed. 40 days. The number echoes through scripture like a sentence handed down by a judge who already knows the verdict. And everything that breathed air, everything with blood in its veins and lungs in its chest, went silent beneath the surface. The Nephilim, those towering abominations born from a union heaven never authorized, sank with the rest. Muscle and bone and fury, all swallowed by black water so deep that the tallest mountains disappeared 15 cubits below the waterline. Noah floated, 8 souls in a wooden vessel sealed with pitch, surrounded by the muffled silence of a drowned civilization. Can you imagine the weight of that quiet? A whole world had been screaming days before. Now, only the creak of gopher wood and the steady pulse of waves against the hull. God's intention seemed absolute. Wipe the corruption clean. Restart from a single righteous family. One bloodline. Pure, uncontaminated. So, what went wrong? Because something did. Clearly, the evidence shows up too soon, too widespread, too deeply embedded in the post-flood world to be coincidence. Canaan, Noah's own grandson through Ham, becomes a cursed name within a single generation. The land that will eventually carry his name, overrun with giants, entire tribes of them, Anakim in Hebron, Rephaim scattered across Bashan, Emim among the Moabites, Zamzumim feared by the Ammonites. Different names, different regions, but the same abnormality. Colossal height, superhuman strength, and a territorial aggression that made normal warfare impossible. Moses recorded the Emim and the Rephaim almost as a footnote in Deuteronomy 2, like he expected readers to already know what those names meant. A people great and many, and tall as the Anakim, the text says. Then adds, almost reluctantly, which also were accounted as giants. Accounted. That word carries weight. The original Hebrew, Rephaim, connects to shades, to the dead, to something that should have stayed buried. These populations weren't just unusually tall families who ate well. Their very name linked them to a realm beneath the earth, to spirits associated with death and the underworld. This is where the ancient record grows deeply unsettling. The Book of Enoch, rejected from the Western canon, but quoted directly by Jude in the New Testament, offers a theory that most theologians tiptoe around. When the Nephilim were destroyed in the flood, their physical bodies perished, but the spirits inside them had no place to go. Half celestial, half terrestrial. Heaven wouldn't receive them. Sheol couldn't contain them. So they wandered, disembodied, hungry, looking for a way back into flesh. Whether you take Enoch literally or symbolically, the pattern in scripture is undeniable. The flood killed the bodies. The bloodline resurfaced anyway. Somewhere between the receding waters and Abraham's first steps into Canaan, the genetic signature of the Nephilim crept back into human populations like a vine growing through cracks in a sealed tomb. The real question, the one that should keep you watching, is through whom did it return? And why did it concentrate so heavily in one specific region? the exact strip of land God promised to Abraham's descendants? That answer hides inside 3 ancient tribal names most pastors never preach about. A name can be a warning. The Anakim knew this because their name literally means long-necked ones, as if the people who first encountered them could only describe what they saw by looking up, craning their necks toward faces that blocked the sun. But where did the Anakim come from? Trace the genealogy backward, and you land on a single father, Anak, son of Abba. And Abba, according to Joshua 14, was the greatest man among the Anakim. Not the tallest, the greatest. The Hebrew word Gadol implies authority, dominion, a founder. Abba built Kiriath Arba, the city that would later be renamed Hebron. He didn't just live in the land of Canaan. He carved a throne into its hills and planted a dynasty of oversized warriors so deeply rooted that even 400 years of Egyptian slavery couldn't make Israel forget the stories. Now shift your eyes east. Across the Jordan, beyond the Dead Sea, another branch of the same ancient tree spread its roots through the plateau of Bashan, the Rephaim. King Og ruled them from Ashtaroth, a city named after a pagan goddess of war and fertility, which tells you everything about what kind of civilization thrived there. Og's bed was made of iron, 9 cubits long, 4 cubits wide, roughly 13 feet by 6 feet. Moses recorded that detail in Deuteronomy 3 with the precision of a war journalist documenting captured enemy equipment. Why mention furniture? Because the bed proved something. A man that size actually existed. Slept, ate, fought, bled. Ogi wasn't legend. He was inventory. And then there were the Emim, the dreaded ones, occupying the plains of Moab. The Zamzumim, whose name some scholars link to a Hebrew root meaning to hum or to buzz, as if their very presence created a low vibration in the atmosphere that people could feel before they could see. Different tribal names, different territories, but pull back far enough and a pattern emerges that should make your pulse quicken. Every single one of these giant clans occupied land that God had specifically designated for Abraham's descendants. Every single one. Hebron, promised to Caleb. Bashan, assigned to the half-tribe of Manasseh. The Jordan Valley, the hill country, the Negev, all of it crawling with oversized warriors positioned like sentinels guarding a gate that Israel was supposed to walk through. Coincidence? Read the text again. When the 12 spies entered Canaan in Numbers 13, they returned with a report that split the nation in half. 10 spies saw the giants and said, "We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and so we seemed in theirs." That comparison, grasshoppers, reveals something beyond fear. It reveals a complete psychological collapse. Trained soldiers, members of tribal leadership, reduced to insects in their own minds by the sheer physical presence of the Anakim. Only Caleb pushed back. "Let us go up at once and take possession, for we are well able to overcome them." The man was standing in front of the same crowd, holding the same cluster of grapes they'd carried back from the valley of Eshcol. And yet his eyes saw something entirely different. While 10 men calculated the height of the walls, Caleb calculated the height of the promise. Israel chose the grasshopper report. 40 years of wilderness followed, 1 year for each day the spies had spent inside the land. An entire generation died in the sand because the shadow of the Anakim was taller than their faith. But the giants didn't disappear during those 40 years. They multiplied, fortified Gath, reinforced Gaza, dug deeper into Hebron. By the time Joshua finally crossed the Jordan with a new generation at his back, the Nephilim bloodline had concentrated itself into 5 Philistine cities like venom pooling in the fangs of a serpent, waiting to strike. One city above all others became the stronghold, a fortress built on ancient bones, governed by warriors who traced their ancestry back to the Rephaim themselves. Its name would haunt Israel for generations. Gath sat on a ridge like a fist raised against the sky. From its walls, you could see the coastal plain stretching toward the Mediterranean, the trade routes snaking south toward Egypt, and, most importantly, the low hills of Judah, where Israelite shepherds grazed their flocks in uneasy silence. The Philistines chose this location with military precision. Gath wasn't just a city. It was a watchtower planted at the exact pressure point between two civilizations that would never stop bleeding each other. But something older than politics lived inside those walls. Joshua 15 records a detail that most readers skip past without blinking. When Joshua drove the Anakim out of Hebron, out of Debir, out of the hill country, where did the survivors flee? 3 cities absorbed them: Gaza, Ashdod, and Gath. The giant clans didn't scatter into the wilderness to die. They retreated into Philistine territory like wounded predators crawling back into a den, and the Philistines welcomed them. Think about that for a moment. Why would a sophisticated Mediterranean culture, a people skilled in ironwork, shipbuilding, and organized warfare, open their gates to a race of genetic anomalies fleeing from Israelite conquest? The answer sits in the economics of ancient war. Giants were weapons, living siege engines. A single Rephaim warrior behind your front line changed the mathematics of every battlefield calculation. The Philistines didn't harbor the Anakim out of compassion. They were building an arsenal. Generations passed. The Anakim intermarried with Philistine nobility. Their bloodline diluted in some branches, concentrated in others. And Gath became the epicenter, the one city where the old Nephilim genetics ran thickest, where mothers still gave birth to sons who outgrew their fathers by the age of 12, where armor had to be forged in special dimensions because standard military equipment couldn't fit across those shoulders. Archaeological excavations at Tel Esafi, the site most scholars identify as ancient Gath, reveal a city far larger than previously assumed. Massive fortifications, evidence of a powerful, independent city-state that operated with unusual autonomy even among the Philistine Pentapolis. Pottery fragments inscribed with names linguistically similar to Goliath have surfaced from strata dating to around the 10th century before the Common Era. The ground itself whispers confirmation. Gath bred warriors the way other cities bred merchants. 2 Samuel 21 pulls back the curtain on this with chilling specificity. 4 separate conflicts, 4 giant warriors, all from Gath. The text uses a Hebrew phrase that scholars have debated for centuries: Yalad Laharafa, born to the giant. Some translate Harafa as a proper name, Rapha, suggesting a single ancestor, a patriarch of monsters whose sons carried his blood like a badge of rank. Others read it as a title, the Giant, a designation reserved for warriors of a particular cursed lineage. Either way, the implication lands like a hammer. Gath didn't just happen to produce a few unusually large soldiers. The city functioned as a breeding ground, a living vault where the Nephilim bloodline, the same corruption that triggered a global flood, was preserved, protected, and weaponized across centuries. 5 sons emerged from that vault. Each one carried a spear, each one carried a name, and each one had a specific target sewn into the fabric of his purpose. Israel had no idea what was coming out of those gates. They remembered Goliath, the loud one, the champion, the 9-foot shadow that paralyzed Saul's entire army for 40 days. But Goliath was only the first card played from a hand that held 4 more. Soldiers talk around fires. They always have. And in the camps of Israel, stretched across the Judean lowlands during the long wars with Philistia, certain names moved through the ranks, the way fever moves through a body. Quiet at first, then impossible to ignore. Goliath. That name came first because he made sure it did. Every morning for 40 days, he stepped into the valley of Elah and announced himself like a verdict. 6 cubits and a span, bronze helmet, scale armor weighing 5,000 shekels, a javelin slung across his back, and a spear in his right hand, whose iron point alone weighed 600 shekels. The man was a walking fortress, and he knew exactly what his presence did to the morale of untested soldiers staring down from the opposite ridge, but whisper past Goliath's name in certain Israelite circles, and older veterans would flinch at a different sound. Lami, the brother. 1 Chronicles 20 records him with a description that mirrors Goliath almost word for word. The shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. Same family, same dimensions, same appetite for Israelite blood. Lami didn't stand in valleys making speeches though. He waited, patient, the kind of predator that lets the louder animal flush the prey into the open. Then came Saf. Some translations call him Sipai. The name shifts depending on whether you're reading 2 Samuel or Chronicles. What doesn't shift is his reputation. He showed up at a battle in Gob, and the text wastes no words on his introduction. Just his name, his lineage, born to the giant, and the fact that he had to be put down by one of David's elite warriors, Sibbecai the Hushathite. No dramatic speech, no 40-day standoff. Saf fought and Saf fell, but the fact that scripture names him individually tells you something critical. He was dangerous enough to remember Ishbi-Benob carried a different kind of weight. His story shows up in 2 Samuel 21, and the details read less like a battle report and more like an assassination attempt. A new sword strapped to his side, a bronze spearhead weighing 300 shekels, and a singular obsession: kill David. The text says he intended to kill David. His singular obsession was to kill the king. This was personal, targeted. Ishbi-Benob tracked David onto the battlefield during a campaign when the king was already exhausted, already old enough that his own men had started worrying about his stamina. The giant saw weakness and moved in for the throat. Abishai, son of Zeruiah, saved David's life that night. Barely. Close enough that afterward David's men made him swear an oath. "You shall go out no more with us to battle, lest you quench the lamp of Israel." The king of Israel was nearly extinguished by a giant most Sunday schools have never mentioned. And then the last one, the nameless one. Scripture doesn't give him a title, only a description. A man of great stature, 6 fingers on each hand, 6 toes on each foot, 24 digits total, born in Gath, born to the giant. He stood on the battlefield and did something the text describes with a single devastating verb. He taunted Israel, mocked them, spit words across the line the same way Goliath had a generation earlier, as if the family had rehearsed this choreography of humiliation and passed it down like an inheritance. Jonathan, son of Shimei, David's own nephew, killed him. But the image lingers longer than the victory. 24 fingers and toes. A body that carried the visible marks of genetic corruption. Of a bloodline so twisted that it produced extra bones, as if nature itself couldn't contain what was trying to express itself through that flesh. 5 warriors, 1 city, each born from the same ancient root that should have drowned beneath the flood. and each aimed at a single nation like arrows drawn from the same cursed quiver. Goliath stepped out first, the loudest, the most theatrical, and he chose a valley that would become the most famous killing floor in human history. The Valley of Elah smells like dry grass and chalk. Even today, if you walk the stream bed where the terebinth trees still grow, you can feel how the terrain funnels sound, amplifies it, bounces it off the limestone ridges on both sides until a single voice carries like thunder rolling between canyon walls. Goliath understood acoustics before anyone gave it a name. Every dawn, he descended from the Philistine camp on the southern ridge and planted himself in the valley floor. Full armor, bronze greaves catching the early light, a shield-bearer walking ahead of him like a herald announcing a king. Except this king carried a spear whose shaft the text compares to a weaver's beam, and whose voice turned the bravest soldiers in Saul's army into statues. Choose a man and let him come down to me. That challenge echoed for 40 consecutive mornings. 40, the same number that defined the flood. The same number that would define Israel's wilderness punishment. 40 is never accidental in Scripture. It marks a period of testing, and Goliath was testing something far deeper than military courage. He was testing whether Israel still believed the God they claimed to serve was bigger than what their eyes could measure. Saul heard the challenge from his tent. The king stood head and shoulders above every other Israelite, the tallest man in the nation, anointed specifically to lead in moments like this. And he froze. His armor stayed on its stand. His sword stayed in its sheath. The man chosen to fight Israel's battles couldn't bring himself to walk into that valley because the mathematics didn't work. Goliath was bigger. Goliath was heavier. Goliath's equipment alone outweighed most soldiers. What kind of strategy overcomes a deficit that's severe? Meanwhile, something interesting was happening in the Israelite camp. Fear had settled into the ranks like fog. Thick, wet, impossible to see through. 1 Samuel 17 says the men fled from him and were greatly afraid. Professional warriors, armed, trained, running from a single opponent because his shadow stretched longer than their faith. But fear does a peculiar thing when it stays too long. It stops feeling like danger and starts feeling like truth. After 40 days, Israel's army had internalized Goliath's dimensions as a fact about reality itself. Giants win. Small men lose. The equations of flesh determine the outcome of every fight. That belief had calcified into doctrine. Unspoken, unchallenged, absolute. And nobody questioned it. Saul didn't question it. Abner didn't question it. The generals, the tribal leaders, the veterans who'd fought Philistines for decades. Silence across the board. An entire military apparatus, funded by tithes and organized by divine mandate, stood paralyzed on a hillside, while one oversized Philistine rewrote their theology with nothing but volume and repetition. Goliath's real weapon was never the spear. Listen carefully, his real weapon was the 40 days. The repetition, morning after morning, the same insult, the same posture, the same unanswered challenge, until Israel's army began to believe that silence was their only option. He wasn't just intimidating them, he was training them, conditioning them to accept that this was the natural order. Giants speak, Israel cowers. The Philistine commanders watching from their ridge must have been grinning. Their investment in Gath's bloodline was paying dividends beyond calculation. A single warrior had neutralized an entire army without swinging his spear once. But on the 40th day, something shifted in the atmosphere. A supply run from Bethlehem brought an unexpected visitor to the Israelite camp. a teenager carrying bread and cheese for his older brothers, smelling like sheep, with no armor, no rank, and no military clearance. He heard the giant's voice, and instead of flinching, his eyes narrowed. The question he asked next would unravel everything Goliath had spent 40 days building. Nobody sent for David. That detail matters more than most sermons let on. Jesse packed bread, roasted grain, and 10 cuts of cheese, provisions for his 3 eldest sons serving in Saul's army, and handed the load to his youngest, a delivery boy. That's all David was supposed to be that morning. Walk to the camp, hand over the food, bring back news, come home. Simple errand. The kind of task you give to the kid who's too young to matter in a war. But God has a habit of hiding earthquakes inside errands. David arrived at the valley of Elah just as the battle lines were forming. The shouting had already started, that daily ritual of organized posturing where 2 armies faced each other across a strip of contested ground and pretended they were about to fight. He left the supplies with the baggage keeper and ran towards the front line to find his brothers. Ran. 1 Samuel 17 uses that word deliberately. A boy excited by the noise, the energy, the sheer spectacle of massed soldiers in formation. He had no context for what was about to happen. Then the ground shook. Goliath stepped out. And while every Israelite soldier within earshot scrambled backward, David did something the text records with quiet precision. He asked a question. What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Read that again slowly. Every other man in the camp was calculating Goliath's height, his armor thickness, his reach advantage, the weight of his spear. David calculated something entirely different. He measured the Philistine against a god and found the giant laughably small. His brother Eliab caught wind of the conversation and exploded. Why did you come down here? Who's watching those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart. You came down to watch the battle. Older brothers have a particular talent for reducing you to your smallest possible version. In Eliab's eyes, David was still the runt who smelled like lanolin and couldn't grow a proper beard. What Eliab didn't know, what nobody in that camp knew, was that the shepherd had already fought monsters. Alone, in the dark, without an audience. Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, David told Saul when the king finally summoned him. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Caught a lion by its beard. That sentence should rearrange how you picture this teenager. The wilderness around Bethlehem was not a pastoral postcard. It was jackal territory, leopard country. The kind of landscape where a shepherd slept with one eye open and a sling within arm's reach because predators didn't send 40-day warnings before they attacked. They came fast, silent, and hungry, and David had been killing them since his hands were barely big enough to grip a stone. Saul looked at the boy and saw a liability, offered his own armor, bronze helmet, coat of mail, the king's personal sword. David put it on, took 2 steps, and stripped it off. I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. A polished answer, but underneath it lay something raw and almost reckless. The boy wasn't being humble. He was being precise. He knew his weapon. He knew his range. And he knew that the God who had delivered him from claws and fangs in the dark wasn't about to lose his nerve in front of a Philistine with a loud voice. 5 smooth stones from the stream bed, a leather sling. He carried no shield, helmet, or sword. The entire Israelite army watched him walk down the slope toward Goliath, and every single one of them thought they were watching a funeral procession. Goliath thought so too. He looked at David and felt insulted. "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" The giant cursed him by his gods, Dagon, Ashtoreth, the whole Philistine pantheon, and promised to feed his flesh to the birds. David's response landed like a blade between the ribs. "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." The valley went quiet. Both armies held their breath. David ran toward the giant. Every military manual ever written says the smaller combatant should circle, dodge, maintain distance, exploit mobility. David ignored all of it. 1 Samuel 17 says he ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. Full sprint, straight ahead. A shepherd boy charging 9 feet of armored hatred with nothing but a leather pouch and a smooth rock pressed between his fingers. Goliath must have smiled. The shield bearer in front of him probably braced for impact, expecting a collision. Some desperate suicidal lunge from a boy too stupid to understand the physics of what was about to happen. The Philistine army on the ridge likely started laughing. This was entertainment now. A lamb walking into a furnace. The sling came around once, maybe twice. Ancient slingers could launch a stone at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour. A fact modern ballistics experts have confirmed through reconstruction experiments. The weapon David carried wasn't a toy. It was a precision instrument that had killed predators in the Judean wilderness, and the hand guiding it had trained on moving targets in low light, under pressure, with a lamb's life hanging on accuracy. One stone. It struck Goliath's forehead, the only exposed surface between the rim of his bronze helmet and the bridge of his nose. A gap no wider than a man's palm. The rock sank directly into the bone. The Hebrew word taba means to sink, to embed, to bury itself. The giant's legs buckled, his knees hit the dirt, and then, with the slow, grinding inevitability of a tower collapsing from its foundation, Goliath fell face first into the valley floor. Face first. That detail is theological, not just physical. Dagon, the Philistine god, had fallen on its face before the Ark of the Covenant in 1 Samuel 5. Same posture, same humiliation. The champion of a false pantheon crumbled in the exact position of a defeated idol. The ground shook when he landed. Silence. Absolute silence across both ridgelines. Then David moved again. He sprinted to the body, drew Goliath's own sword from its sheath, because the boy had brought no sword of his own, and severed the giant's head. The champion's weapon became the instrument of his dismemberment. There's an irony buried in that act so sharp, it almost cuts through the page. What happened next unfolded faster than panic. The Philistine army, which moments before had been grinning from their ridge, watched their invincible weapon lying headless in the stream bed. Their formation broke. Soldiers turned. Officers screamed orders that nobody followed. And Israel, 40 days of cowering Israel, grasshopper Israel, trembling behind supply wagons Israel, roared down the hillside with a sound that hadn't left their throats in over a month. The pursuit ran all the way to Gath, all the way to Ekron. Philistine dead littered the road like milestones. The text says Israel plundered their camp, seized the food, the weapons, the gold, everything the Philistines had brought for a victory celebration that never materialized. David kept the head, carried it to Jerusalem, let it rot in public view as a message, not to the Philistines, but to every Israelite who had spent 40 days believing that flesh determines destiny. Saul watched all of this from his tent. The king who should have been the one walking into that valley. The tallest man in Israel, anointed for exactly this kind of moment, standing in the shade while a teenager did what he couldn't. Something shifted behind Saul's eyes that day. Admiration curdling into something darker, more acidic. The kind of emotion that would eventually chase David through caves and deserts for years. But the celebration in Israel's camp missed a critical detail. Goliath was dead. Victory was won. The valley of Elah belonged to Israel again. Except Gath was still standing. And inside those walls, 4 brothers received the news that their eldest had fallen. Grief, if creatures like them could feel it, hardened quickly into something far more dangerous. Something calculated. Something patient. Revenge doesn't announce itself with a 40-day challenge. It waits for the right night, the right exhaustion, the right moment of weakness. And David, now a celebrated hero, now a target wearing a crown, had just painted the largest bullseye in the ancient world across his own back. Years bled into years. David survived Saul's javelin, the wilderness, the caves, the betrayals, and emerged wearing the crown of a united Israel. Wars with Philistia became routine, border skirmishes, raids, the low, grinding friction of 2 nations sharing a contested frontier. Soldiers on both sides grew old, fighting the same enemy across the same hills, and the memory of Elah slowly faded into campfire legend. Gath remembered differently. Inside that city, Goliath's death wasn't a story. It was an open wound. The champion's brothers had watched his head paraded through Israelite territory. They'd heard the women singing, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s," and understood exactly whose skull had contributed to that body count. Shame among warrior cultures doesn't heal, it ferments. And what fermented inside the sons of Rapha was something blacker than grief, thicker than anger. A blood debt that only blood could settle. Saph moved first. 2 Samuel 21 records the battle at Gob, a location so minor that scholars still argue about where exactly it sat on the map. But geography doesn't matter here. What matters is that Saph walked onto that field carrying the same Rephaim genetics, the same towering frame, the same spear designed for hands twice the size of a normal soldier's grip. He came looking for David's men the way a predator returns to a watering hole where it once lost a kill. Sibbecai, the Hushathite, met him. The text gives Sibbecai no speech, no dramatic monologue, no pre-battle prayer. Just a name, a tribal affiliation, and a result. He struck him down and he died. Clean, professional. The kind of kill that only a warrior from David's elite guard could execute against an opponent that size. Sibbecai belonged to the 30. David's hand-picked circle of fighters whose resumes read like a horror novelist's fever dream. These men had spent decades perfecting the art of killing things that shouldn't be killable. Saph fell, but the debt remained unpaid. Then Lami stepped out of Gath's shadow. 1 Chronicles 20 introduces him with a bloodline credential that reads like a threat. Lami, the brother of Goliath the Gittite. Brother. The word hangs in the air like the smell of iron before a storm. This wasn't some distant cousin or tribal associate. Same father, same mother, same blood running through veins wrapped around the same oversized bones. His spear shaft matched Goliath's description exactly, like a weaver's beam. The same weapon, the same dimensions, as if the family had a template, a standard issue armament designed specifically for hands born from the giant's line. Lami carried his brother's war into a new generation, and behind his eyes burned the specific, focused rage of a sibling who has spent years rehearsing a single moment. Elhanan, son of Jair, killed him. The chronicler spends even fewer words on this death than on Saph's, a brevity that almost feels disrespectful until you realize what it communicates. These giants, these sons of Rapha, these walking remnants of a pre-flood corruption that nearly consumed the earth, were being dismantled, methodically, one by men whose names most Bible readers have never encountered. And that is the hidden architecture of this entire passage. David killed Goliath in a valley with the whole world watching. Dramatic, cinematic, the kind of moment that launches dynasties and inspires psalms. But the cleanup, the slow, unglamorous extermination of the remaining bloodline, fell to men who would never headline a sermon. Sibbecai, Elhanan, soldiers whose obedience outweighed their fame. Gath's walls were thinning. 2 of Rapha's sons lay dead in foreign soil. The Philistine elders must have felt the shift, the slow, terrible mathematics of a family being subtracted from existence, one warrior at a time. 2 brothers remained, Ishbi-Benob, sharpening a new sword in the dark, and the nameless one, counting his 24 fingers around the grip of a weapon, waiting for his turn to taunt the armies of Israel one final time. But Ishbi-Benob wouldn't wait for a battlefield. He had a different plan, quieter, closer, the kind that required darkness and a king too tired to lift his own shield. David was tired, the kind of tired that lives in your bones, not your muscles. The accumulated weight of decades spent running, fighting, governing, sinning, repenting, and carrying a nation on shoulders that were never as broad as people assumed. He was no longer the boy from the streambed. Grey threaded his beard. Old wounds ached when the temperature dropped. The sling still hung from his belt, but his arm didn't snap the way it used to. 2 Samuel 21 opens this scene with a phrase that should chill every reader who loves David. David grew faint, mid-battle, surrounded by Philistine infantry. The king of Israel, the giant killer, the man after God's own heart, was running out of breath on a battlefield that didn't care about his resume. Ishbi-Benob saw it. The text identifies him with surgical precision. Descendant of the giant, armed with a new sword. Freshly forged, untested, built for one purpose. His bronze spearhead weighed 300 shekels, lighter than Goliath's, faster, designed for close-range killing rather than the theatrical distance of a champion's challenge. Ishbi-Benob hadn't come to make speeches. He'd come to finish something his oldest brother started and failed to complete in a valley decades earlier. He intended to kill David. Scripture rarely reveals motive with that kind of directness. Most battle narratives describe actions, who fought, who fell, who fled. But the author of 2 Samuel 21 reaches inside Ishbi-Benob's skull and pulls out the raw intention. This giant crossed the battlefield with a singular target. Soldiers clashed around him. Swords rang against shields. Men screamed and bled and died in the chaos of ancient melee combat. And Ishbi-Benob walked through all of it like a man moving through furniture in a familiar room. His eyes were locked on one figure, the aging king whose crown glinted through the dust. Picture David in that moment, bent forward, breathing through his mouth, sword arm shaking from exertion. The soldiers around him were likely fighting their own battles, too occupied to notice that their king had slowed down, that the legendary stamina had finally cracked, that the shepherd who once ran toward Goliath could barely stay upright. Ishbi-Benob closed the distance, new sword drawn, 300 shekels of bronze aimed at the most important neck in Israel. This was it. The kill shot the sons of Rapha had been owed since a stone cracked their brother's forehead in the valley of Elah. Decades of waiting, decades of watching siblings march out and not return. All of it funneled into the width of a blade's edge, swinging toward David. Abishai appeared from nowhere. The son of Zeruiah, David's nephew, one of the most violent and loyal men in all of Scripture, threw himself between the giant and the king. The text compresses what must have been a ferocious exchange into a single sentence. Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, came to his aid and attacked the Philistine and killed him. No details about the fight, no description of technique or duration, just intervention, combat, death. Abishai handled Ishbi-Benob the way a bodyguard handles a threat, with maximum force and minimum conversation. What followed that rescue changed the trajectory of David's entire military career. His men, the 30, the mighty warriors, the elite circle who had followed him since the caves of Adullam, made the king swear an oath. "You shall no longer go out with us to battle, lest you quench the lamp of Israel." Lamp. They called him a lamp. The metaphor reveals how David's warriors understood the stakes of what had almost happened. A lamp extinguished means darkness, not just for a household, but for a nation, a covenant, a messianic lineage that stretched forward through centuries toward a promise most of them didn't fully understand yet. If Ishbi-Benob's blade had connected, the line of Judah would have been decapitated. The throne would have collapsed into civil war. The genealogy that Matthew's gospel would one day trace from Abraham through David to a manger in Bethlehem, severed. Ishbi-Benob came closer to destroying the future than any general, any army, any empire in Israel's history. Not through strategic brilliance, through patience, waiting for the moment when the giant killer was too tired to kill giants anymore. David never fought on a battlefield again. One son of Rapha still breathed inside Gath, the strangest one. The one whose body carried visible proof that the bloodline was unraveling. Extra fingers, extra toes, a frame built from corrupted blueprints. And he had one final message for Israel. 6 fingers wrapped around the spear shaft, 6 on each hand. 12 fingers gripping a weapon that most soldiers needed 2 normal hands to lift. And below, 6 toes on each foot, pressing into the dirt of a battlefield where his brothers had already bled and failed. 24 digits total, a body that arithmetic itself seemed to reject. Scripture never gives this man a name. Think about that. His 4 brothers carried names that commanded fear and historical record. But the last son of Rapha walks into the biblical record carrying nothing but a physical description and an attitude. 2 Samuel 21 calls him simply a man of great stature, who had 6 fingers on every hand and 6 toes on every foot. Then adds the genealogical tag like a brand seared into cattle. He also was born to the giant. Why no name? Some scholars suggest the original records were damaged or incomplete. Others propose a more unsettling possibility, that this warrior's identity had been deliberately consumed by his deformity. Among the Philistines, among his own people, he wasn't called by a birth name. He was the fingers. The extra digits defined him so completely that whatever his mother whispered over his cradle had been erased by what the world saw when he held up his hands. Polydactyly, the medical term for extra fingers or toes, occurs naturally in human populations. Roughly 1 in every 500 births. Usually a single extra digit, often non-functional, frequently removed in infancy. But this man carried the condition on all 4 extremities, with apparent full functionality. He gripped weapons. He walked battlefields. His body operated with those additional bones as if they'd been engineered rather than accidental. And he knew what he looked like, knew the effect those hands produced when he spread them wide in front of an enemy formation. Because the text says he did exactly what Goliath had done a generation earlier. He stood before Israel and taunted them, defied them, opened his mouth and hurled the same corrosive mockery that his eldest brother had perfected in the valley of Elah. Imagine an Israelite soldier on the front line, watching this figure emerge from the Philistine ranks. The height alone would trigger memories, collective trauma passed down through the army like a scar that never fully closed. But then the hands. Those hands! 12 fingers flexing around a spear shaft, each one a visible marker of something wrong at the genetic level. Something that whispered of an origin older and darker than normal human variation. The Nephilim signature, written in bone. The taunt itself goes unrecorded. Scripture doesn't preserve his words the way it preserved Goliath's theatrical speeches. Maybe the content didn't matter. Maybe the act of defiance was the message. One final son of Rapha, visibly corrupted, physically marked by a lineage that God had tried to erase with a flood, standing upright in the sunlight and laughing at the chosen people. A living insult, breathing blasphemy, given a skeleton and a voice. Jonathan, son of Shimei, stepped forward. David's nephew. The family connection matters here. The house of Jesse was finishing what it started. David threw the first stone. Now David's own blood was throwing the last sword stroke. Jonathan killed the giant, and the text moves past the death with the same clinical brevity it used for Saf and Lami. No eulogy, no dramatic final words, just steel meeting flesh and another son of Rapha collapsing into the same dust that had already swallowed his brothers. 2 Samuel 21 closes this sequence with a verse that reads like an accountant tallying a final ledger. These 4 were born to the giant in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. 4 giants plus Goliath, 5 total, all from one city, all from one bloodline, all dead. Gath stood silent after the last body dropped. The furnace that had forged oversized warriors for generations had finally burned through its fuel. No more sons of Rapha paced behind those walls. No more mothers bore children with spear shaft forearms and voices that carried across valleys like war drums. But the story doesn't end with a body count. A question remains. The one this entire film has been building toward. Why did this bloodline exist in the first place? Why did it survive the flood? Why did it concentrate in the exact territory promised to Israel? And why did it have to be exterminated so completely that even the unnamed, the deformed, the last twisted echo of the Nephilim had to be struck down before the promise could move forward? Pull back far enough and a shape emerges from the chaos. Every battle, every giant, every spear shaft and severed head, none of it was random. A thread runs through the entire biblical narrative, from Genesis 3 to the last son of Rapha bleeding out in the dirt, and that thread has a name. The seed. Genesis 3:15. God speaks to the serpent in the garden and delivers a sentence that theologians call the proto-evangelium, the first gospel. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. A future descendant of Eve would crush the serpent's authority. One specific human, born through one specific lineage, carrying the weight of cosmic redemption in his DNA. The enemy understood the threat before humanity did. Consider Genesis 6 through that lens. The sons of God didn't descend to earth because human women were beautiful. Beauty was the mechanism. Contamination was the objective. If the seed had to come through human genetics, then corrupt the genetics. Pollute the bloodline so thoroughly that no pure vessel remains. Drown the promise in hybrid flesh before it ever reaches a manger, a cross, a tomb. The flood was the countermeasure. Preserve Noah, perfect in his generations, the Hebrew word tamim, implying genetic wholeness, unblemished lineage, and restart. Wash the corruption off the planet and begin again with clean blood. But the enemy adapted. Somehow, through mechanisms the text leaves deliberately shadowed, the giant bloodline resurfaced after the waters receded. Anakim in Hebron, Rephaim in Bashan. And where did these populations concentrate? Canaan, the exact territory God had promised to Abraham. The man through whose descendants the seed would eventually arrive. Coincidence collapses under that weight. The Nephilim weren't randomly distributed across the ancient world. They were strategically positioned. Hebron, where Abraham buried Sarah, where the patriarchal covenant was physically rooted, occupied by Anak's sons. The Jordan Valley, Israel's entry point into the Promised Land, guarded by Og of Bashan, sleeping on his iron bed like a sentinel posted at heaven's gate. Every giant was a blockade. Every oversized warrior standing between Israel and their inheritance functioned as a biological barrier designed to prevent one nation from occupying one piece of land long enough to produce one descendant who would crush one serpent's head. That is why Goliath challenged Israel for 40 days. The defiance was pure spiritual sabotage. Keep Israel afraid. Keep them frozen on a hillside. Keep them worshipping a grasshopper theology that says flesh determines outcome. Because if they believe that, they'll never advance. They'll never take the land. They'll never establish the throne of David. And the seed will never arrive. David's stone didn't just kill a giant. It cracked open a door. The throne of Judah was established because a shepherd refused to calculate in human dimensions. And from that throne, through Solomon, through Rehoboam, through a genealogy riddled with scandal and grace and improbable survival, the lineage marched forward toward Bethlehem. But the door had to be cleared completely. One surviving son of Rapha could father another generation. One living giant could produce 10 more. The bloodline had already demonstrated its resilience, surviving a global flood, reconstituting itself across centuries, embedding itself in fortified cities. Leaving even a single branch alive was a risk the covenant couldn't absorb. So Sibbecai killed Saph. Elhanan killed Lahmi. Abishai killed Ishbi-Benob. Jonathan killed the nameless one with 24 fingers. Each death was a lock turning. Each fallen giant was a chain removed from a gate that needed to swing open wide enough for a carpenter from Nazareth to walk through centuries later, carrying wood on his shoulders toward a hill called Golgotha. Golgotha, the place of the skull. Some ancient traditions, unverifiable, debated, but persistent across centuries of Jewish and early Christian commentary, suggest that Golgotha earned its name because a giant's skull was buried beneath it. Whose skull? The traditions whisper a name that closes the circle so perfectly it feels engineered by a mind far older than human history. David carried Goliath's head to Jerusalem. The cross was planted on the place of the skull. The seed of the woman, bruising the serpent's head, standing on the crushed remains of the Nephilim's greatest champion. 5 giants, 5 stones David picked from the brook, 1 for Goliath, 4 still sitting in his pouch when the battle ended. 1 for each brother he didn't yet know existed. A shepherd boy grabbed exactly the right number of weapons for an enemy he hadn't fully met, guided by a hand that had been counting giants since before the flood. The bloodline is finished. The gate stands open, and the seed arrived.